שלום לכולם, חברים, אנחנו 135 משתתפים, 136 וממשיכים לעלות. החלטנו, לאור הביקוש המאוד מאוד גדול והרצון לאפשר לכולכם להיות חלק מהקהילה שאנחנו בעצם מנסים לייצר, לפתוח את זה לכמה שיותר מכם. אז שלום לכולם ולכולן. אנחנו בתקופה הזויה ומטורללת, ולא שהייתי צריך הוכחה נוספת לזה, אבל זה שבתקופה כזאת הזויה הקהילה הזאת ממשיכה את הביחד, האווירה, הטיפוס באונליין מחזק את כל הדברים שכבר ידעתי, ולכן כל כך כיף לי, ונראה לי שלכולנו להיות חלק מהעולם הזה של הטיפוס ומהקהילה הזאת. אחרי התלבטויות, כמו שאמרתי, החלטנו להרחיב את חשבון הזום, על מנת שכל מי שרוצה ורוצה יוכלו להיות חלק מהקהילה הזאת והביחד. גם זה, כמו עוד הרבה דברים אחרים, עולה כסף, בולטים, תחנות, ייעוץ משפטי, התנהלות מול הרשויות, שאני מניח שראיתם שאנחנו מתעסקים איתה לא מעט בתקופה הזאת, על מנת להמשיך ולפתח את הענף ועוד ועוד. ומעבר לכסף ישנה חשיבות להאם אנחנו מגיעים לישיבה ומייצגים אלפי חברים, כמו איגודי הצלילה והאופניים, או מצטיירים כאיגוד קטן המונה פחות מ1,000 חברים, כשבפועל אנחנו הרבה יותר. אז מה אני בעצם אומר פה, ומה כל המונולוג הגדול הזה? שההתאחדות עובדת כל השנה על מנת לקיים אירועים, לפתוח מצוקים בשטח, להעביר תכנים מקצועיים, לדחוף את הענף קדימה ולהשיג לכם הטבות בלעדיות ומבצעים. פשוט אנחנו צריכים שתהיו חברים שלנו, שתהיו חברים אחד של השני ושתהיו חברי התאחדות. החברות היא עד סוף אוקטובר, ולכן כרגע זה עולה 100 שקלים בלבד לחברות חצי שנתית. החברות שלכם תאפשר לנו, לרובנו המוחלט, המתנדבים, להמשיך לעבוד בשבילכם, לפתח את הענף, ובעיניי, יותר מהכל, לייצר קהילה. בשלב הזה, I'm gonna move to English, back to English. Hi, Lynn. It will take way too long to mention all your achievements in first ascents, so instead I will just read the intro to your Wikipedia page.
Okay.
So, Carolyn Mary Lynn Hill is a U.S. rock climber widely regarded as one of the leading competitive sport climbers in the world during the late 1980s and early 1990s. She's famous for making the first free ascent of the difficult sheer rock face of the nose on El Capitan in Yosemite Valley, and for repeating in the next year in less than 24 hours. She has been described as both one of the best female climbers in the world and one of the best climbers of all time. One of the first successful women in the sport, Hill-shaped rock climbing for women and became a public spokesperson, helping it gain wider popularity and arguing for sex equality. Hill has publicized climbing by appearing on television shows and documentaries and writing on an autobiography, Climbing Free: My Life in the Vertical World. So first of all, it may be seen, I'm a bit excited and even nervous myself. Lynn, you wrote much of the history of climbing yourself. Today we'll try to go through your history and understand how things evolved and unfolded from your perspective. So hello, Lynn Hill.
Hello, shalom. What's the other part? Shalom, la kalom, or something? I'm
Shalom,
listening.
I think shalom. Shalom is
shalom.
Hello. It's
Hello.
Actually hello and also peace.
Shalom.
So thank you so much for being here with us. First of all, how are you during these strange and difficult times with the reality of COVID-19?
Surprisingly well. I know that there's a lot of pain and difficulty in the world, which is not fun for so many people, and there's a lot of loss. And the economy is obviously in trouble now, but I think that if we all have a positive attitude towards what we can do now, being creative with our time, connecting with people in a different way. And for me, it's been good because I've been getting some projects done that I've been putting off because it takes a lot of concentration and time without interruptions for me to get some of this work done. So with no pending things like picking my son up from wherever, my son is 17 years old now. They don't have school for the rest of the year at school. They have online learning. So a lot of the distractions are gone, and I'm not using my car as much, which is great. It's good for the environment too. It's a lot more clear and peaceful. And, you know, I still have the opportunity to go in my backyard, which is, well, literally my backyard. And then right next to my house, there's open space. So I can still walk my dog.
You currently live in Boulder, Colorado.
I live in Boulder, Colorado, not far from downtown, but there are hills that come right up to the base of the city. And the hills go pretty much into the Rocky Mountains from here. I mean, they're populated because it's next to the city. There's a lot of trails with a lot of people, but I know how to avoid people pretty well. There's certain parts where I'll run into people, but it's wide and you can go far away from people. And so it's been an interesting change for a lot of us. And I think that there's been some good sides with relationships, like with my son. He eats with us now, and he speaks more with us. It's more of like a maturing, I'd say. And so slowing down is a good thing for a lot of us to reflect on life.
It's definitely a time of weird and strange circumstances that make us all kind of get back to the origins of who we are and getting to know back each other and talk more maybe. If we talk about that, maybe let's start with the beginning. Where were you born? Can you share a bit about your family and childhood?
I was born in Detroit, Michigan, and I'm the fifth born child out of 7. I'm less than 5 years younger than my oldest sister, so my mother was busy, boom, boom, boom. And then the last child was 4 years after me. So 4 brothers, 2 sisters. Detroit, Michigan is in the Midwest, and not a place that I'd want to live now, but there's a lot of good things about Michigan. My boyfriend is from Michigan now. And it's funny because I hear certain ways of speaking that remind me of my parents, because they were raised in Michigan. But I was raised in Southern California with the rest of my brothers and sisters. They moved just for 1 year for my father's studies in Ohio, and he's an engineer, was an engineer. He's no longer alive. He died about 12 years ago. And so he had a job at North American Rockwell. My mother was a dental hygienist, and so she worked part-time, and the rest of the time she was busy taking us to various activities. We were a pretty active family. We went on camping trips and a lot of traditional sports too. I was a gymnast and I played softball. My brothers played baseball and football and all the other kid activities and little club things that we do.
So sports was something that you were familiar with from an early age, but you also, in your autobiography, there are a few things you mentioned. You mentioned being a tomboy, and you also mentioned being resistant to rules and noticing from a very early age that the boys in the family had different chores than the girls.
The girls, yeah. Well, the girls had to take care of the household, very classic. But if you think about how much work is required for making food, cleaning up after the food, cleaning the bathroom, vacuuming, and keeping the house clean, that's a lot more work than the boys had to do with taking the trash cans out once a week and back in, or mowing the lawn. And I remember times even weeding, taking out weeds. We would earn money so that we could go to the fair, so get like a penny a weed. But we did, I think, more work than the boys, and there were more of them. There were only 3 girls and 4 boys, so it wasn't exactly an even division of labor back then. But I think it was okay. I mean, in the end, it wasn't terrible either. I think.
Do you remember yourself having any debates or arguments about it with your parents?
I brought it up because I do remember for about a month, I felt like I was the only one that had to do the dishes. And for some reason, it was just on me every night. And that's a lot, 9 people always doing the dishes for everybody and, cleaning up at the table, and everybody else just gets up and runs outside and plays. And you're like, wait, I want to too. But as a tomboy, I realized that I liked to play outside. I liked to wear my blue jeans and climb trees and the neighborhood light pole. And people thought that was more of a boy's activity. So that's why I was called a tomboy. So I embraced that, and I accepted who I was and am. And I didn't feel like that was a bad thing. I thought that other people had the issue. And that's why when it comes to rules, I mean, I understand why rules exist, and it's to be respectful of other people. But if a rule is to limit you from being who you are truly, then it's not a rule that I'm going to follow. That's a personal choice.
Now, in our initial talks, I told you that you're a hero of mine, a heroine, and but it is important for me to put it out there that I perceive you first and foremost as an athlete before you're a woman, and it's very important to put it out there on the one hand, and on the other hand, this entire interview is going to revolve also about you being a woman because it's a major theme throughout your history and career.
Not in the beginning as
so
much.
I just wanted to put it up. Okay, yeah. So actually, do you want to explain a bit?
I'll tell you. So what I mean by that is, yes, there were stereotypes in the world, more so than today, because I think that as society evolves, it becomes more equal. And I think we're working towards that. But I think in the beginning, as a rock climber, we were all very unusual. We were kind of marginal, you know, some people call us marginal as far as society norms. We were on the outside of the typical person. So because we all felt that we had this common bond of climbing and we loved playing and we kind of understood the same values. So we were climbers before we were men and women. Of course, we were men and women in certain roles, but I think that I felt very accepted as an individual in my group of climbers, the Stone Masters, let's call it, at that point when I was a little bit older.
At that point, you're actually leading me to my next question, and I want to read another part of your autobiography. And it goes as follows. I'd been a child during the 1960s when women burned their bras and hundreds of thousands gathered in protest against the Vietnam War. As a climber, I've felt connected to a similar nonconformist culture and opposed to society's increasing materialism, pollution, and corruption. Our approach to the rock, clean, traditional climbing with the least dependence on equipment was an extension of this ethical viewpoint. And at that point, I want to ask you about Yosemite and about Camp 4. So for those of us who don't know anything about Camp 4, can you explain what Camp 4 is?
Camp 4 is where the climbers go to camp when they're climbing in Yosemite. It's a walk-in campground. There is a parking lot nearby, but you walk into your campsite. It's become very difficult to get a campsite there nowadays, and there's I think 2-week limit. They might have changed it even more to 10 days now. So people from all over the world go there. It was the melting pot of climbing, the laboratory of climbing back in the day, and still is. People will come to learn about big wall climbing. It's a very unique place to learn about that because it's on one hand close to society and the roads and rescue if you need it, but it's a 3,000-foot wall. Well, at least El Cap is, and there's lots of rock walls all around. And it's just, if you're a climber, you're drawn to this magical, beautiful place. And it's most climbers' goals, if they really want to be well-rounded climbers, to come and at least do a big wall once in their life. So Camp 4 is a historical place. The parks, they have a concession that sells food, and they have a post office there. They have a little village, and there was a time when they wanted to get rid of Camp 4 and make it into employee housing. And Tom Frost got a group of people together. I was one of the people that signed on this legal protest, or basically it was to make that Camp 4 into a national historic place. And that's what he did, and that's how he saved it. And it cost a lot of money and time.
So maybe you can just shortly explain how you actually started climbing, how you wind up leaving in Camp 4 and in Yosemite.
I started for my time period at a relatively young age. I was 14. So I started through my older sister, who's 5 years older than me, and she had a boyfriend that was, I think, a year older than her. And he was the one that saw the notice in an outdoor shop, free lessons to learn how to belay and rappel off of a cement block in the parking lot. We didn't live near climbing areas, really. I mean, we lived probably an hour away from one area, Big Rock, and another one, Stony Point. Those are kind of like urban climbing areas. But anyway, so they learned to climb, and I was already climbing trees and acting as a tomboy as I was. And they kind of guessed correctly that I would like it. So after they'd been climbing for 3 years, they all went out to this one area, Big Rock, which is about an hour away from our house. And my sister ended up teaching me and my other sister to climb, while her boyfriend and my brother went off and did some climbs of their own. But my sister didn't want to tell us because she was always like the one responsible. Her nickname was Mom. And she always had the answer. So she didn't want to admit that she was afraid of leading. So she showed us how to tie a water knot so that we could make a Swiss seat out of webbing. And she showed us how to tie the knot and gave us a few carabiners and said, okay, go. And we led our first climb, which was horrifying on a slab, you know, with no distinctive holds, just balance.
And obviously no bolts, just for everyone to understand.
But they were bolts on this slab.
Oh, really?
There were bolts.
Oh,
yes.
really? Okay.
But I did have an experience at Joshua Tree, my first time there. Same thing happened. Chuck, her boyfriend, said, I'm going to go off over here. Why don't you take Lynn and show her how to trad climb? And the only thing I had seen about trad climbing was Chuck, maybe the day before, he showed me on the ground a boulder with a little crack in it. And he showed me how you would wedge a stopper in the crack, or it could be a hex. Those were all the only tools that we had. No camming devices at that time. This picture is taken a little bit later.
Yes, so yes. I couldn't find any pictures of your very, very early beginning.
Well, they don't exist because people didn't bring.
Yeah.
I mean, some people brought cameras, but that was all. Actually, there was one picture at Big Rock. Maybe it wasn't one that you've seen, but it's just a low angle slab, and I'm standing there. It happened to be the first day. I wasn't climbing though. I was just standing at the base. But I was supposed to go up this one climb, and the first part of it was a boulder, just, you know, sort of slab, and you get up on top of that, and, you know, you look down, and I've climbed up 2 different boulders, and now I'm about 25 feet off the ground, and I'm supposed to stand up and find some way to put a chalk in. My sister said, oh yeah, there's something right there, put it in, and then just keep going. And it's actually really steep there. You put something in and then you go around. It was very unclear. Even
did your parents know what you were doing?
No.
Were they aware? No. And,
well, my mother did come to that same formation many years later and watched me climb, but she didn't know what we were doing, had no idea. And we also, actually, the first day I ever went rappelling, it was a family hiking trip, ironically, up to Mount Baldy, another area that's not really known for climbing, but there are some rocks there. I think there might be some bouldering now that's been developed, but we didn't know anything about that. My brother brought some piece of, it looked like a sailing rope or something. It wasn't even like a real climbing rope. And he set up this rappel on a boulder. And of course, I agreed to do it that day.
And if we fast forward a bit, how did you end up in Camp 4, and what was the experience in Camp 4? I saw a lot of it in the movies, but still, I'm really interested in hearing it from you.
Well, so again, my sister's boyfriend wanted to go to Yosemite, like everyone who was interested in climbing at that time. And he was climbing with my brother again. They did the Lost Arrow Spire on this one trip. And my sister said, you can come with me. I'm going up to Yosemite. And I was so excited. And we jumped in the car and drove up there. And the first night around the campfire in Camp 4, there's a lot of people. You know, people show up. And I met Charlie Rowe, who ended up being my first boyfriend. And he had experience. He was a year older than me. Maybe a little bit less, but pretty much the same age as me. And we were kind of the 2 youngest serious climbers at that campfire. So he showed me how to, you know, boulder on some of the classic boulders of Camp 4. There's blue suede shoes, and it's a very balancy, very small hold boulder problem there. And that's also, this area is also where Midnight Lightning is, that you showed some images earlier. So it's historic, and people congregate in campfires, and that's how they end up meeting partners sometimes, lifelong friends. It's been a gathering spot for many climbers for many, many years.
And for how long had you stayed there?
Well, I was just a kid, right? At that time, I was 16 when I first went there with my sister. So I think we stayed a week, maybe not even a full week, whatever we could afford time-wise. My sister was always very serious about her studies. She ended up becoming a pharmacist. And then I I worked at small jobs back in Southern California so that I could buy my own climbing rope and be more independent. And I ended up coming back to the valley and met my boyfriend. And at the age of 17, we climbed Half Dome together. So I did get back on my own, but it was complicated without a car and without a lot of means to travel like that. Once you get to the valley, it's pretty easy. You can get around no problem. There's buses that go around the valley, or you can walk, or maybe even get a bicycle to ride around to get to the different formations.
And did you have an apartment there? Did you sleep in sleeping bags? What did you eat? What was reality back then?
Reality was pretty much the dirtbag lifestyle. I lived in Camp 4 in the rescue site, they called it. Right now there's those canvas tents, those big white tents, and it's actual housing for the rescue climbers. And I think that it's a lot more organized. They actually have more of a job, if you will, but only if they need a rescue, and they will call them, and they have to sometimes do gruesome cleanups, with somebody that's taken a fatal fall or something like that. And they're the ones that have to go up and deal with it. And it's oftentimes their friends in those cases. So we were able to stay in just a patch of dirt underneath a pine tree. And I put my stuff in a bear box. That's a camping shot. Yep. Sleeping bags. At least we had some Insulite pads, those really thin, light colored ones. That's in Joshua Tree that you're looking at though. But that same sort of scene on a weekend, whoever got there first would try to get a campsite and allow all their friends to stay there, but you could only have so many cars, and the rangers would sometimes crack down on that. And of course, nowadays it's really more difficult. But nowadays we're older and we have friends that bought property in places like that. So it's a lot different.
I have a feeling nowadays you're quite okay in terms of finding your way around. I am interested though, about how you were accepted as a woman. You said something about it that you were pretty equal, but still I'm kind of interested in, was it an issue?
Well, I was talking to my friend Mari the other day, who is my best friend, let's call her. We've been friends since, I think I was about 17 when I met her. And at the age of 18, we climbed the nose together. We ended up having to drag our male friend, Dean, who's a great photographer. He's taken a lot of black and white photographs that maybe you've seen. But he was afraid of leading and being up off the ground that high. So he's like, you girls have to finish leading. So that was our first big climb together. Then the following year, we climbed the Shield together. Now, we weren't aid climbers. We were rock climbers, trad climbers specifically. I mean, there were bolts on some of the climbs that we did, but a lot of times there were little 1/4-inch bolts that would rust out, and you would not want to take big falls onto those bolts. And that's changed too. I think that they've been replaced, and there's a whole committee out in Joshua Tree now that takes care of that. But back in the day, you just had to make good decisions. And number one rule was don't fall.
Which makes perfect sense when you're 1,000 feet off the ground.
But I did fall on this one climb on the Shield. I put in a piton, lost arrow, and it was not in all the way. And I thought, oh, well, that's good enough. I just was losing patience. It's so slow. It takes hours to do a pitch. It took us 6 days to get up the Shield. And our boyfriends were the only ones that had any confidence in us. All around the guys on the rescue team and just whoever knew that we're up there thought for sure we were going to at least have to be rescued or bail off the climb. So they didn't think that we could do it.
I have a question. Are you ever afraid? Were you ever afraid?
Well, obviously, when when I fell that time, and you sort of clank against the rock. It's not so much the physical banging against the rock, but because it happens so fast and it's over, and you have adrenaline. So definitely there's a shot of adrenaline, and I think your imagination can run away, meaning that you might exaggerate what could happen. The reality, fortunately for me, has been a lot better than what it could have been, especially when I did take a 72-foot fall from the top of a climb in Buttes, because I didn't finish my knot. I started to tie it, got distracted. Somebody was talking to me, talking to my belayer. I had a jacket on, and I just didn't see that I'd forgotten the knot, because it went through my harness, which was a brand new harness, brand new rope, and it just stayed there. And it was an easy top rope, and I didn't feel the tension on my harness. So I didn't really think much of it until I turned and said, "Hey, take," and I didn't feel the tension on the harness. And he was also talking to that same person. So I pulled the other side of the rope, and that's when I took a real big fall.
So I was planning on talking about it later, because on the timeline it happens way later. But you know what? Let's talk about it now.
Yep.
A major fall. How long did it take you to recover?
I climbed again probably 29 days later. And so my biggest injury was a dislocated elbow. And that was it. You know, I might have stress fractured my feet when they slammed on the ground. But I'm pretty sure what happened, I kind of vaguely remember this. A lot of strange things happen when you fall like that. There's the brain that erases the trauma, and you know, maybe just getting hit somewhat on the head. I don't know. I don't remember having any serious brain problems. They did a CAT scan, and my brain was fine. But I remember looking over my shoulder and seeing the leaves of the tree.
Was it the canopy?
Well, just a branch, and not a lot. And so I kind of turned towards the tree, and my idea was to grab the tree for dear life. And that's how I saved, well, the tree saved me, but if I hadn't grabbed like I did, which then dislocated my elbow, it slowed me down a lot. So it wasn't a very big tree. I probably, you know, gave all of my energy holding onto that branch. I don't know if it broke or if it
it really is a crazy story. And more than I'm interested in your physical rehabilitation, I'm interested in your mental rehabilitation. How did you get back to doing all the things you did and still do?
Well, this happened right at the very beginning of my competition career, you might say. It was the very first World Cup in the history of the sport happening in England. So I was really disappointed to miss that. And it felt like I was missing out on a lot at that particular time. So I did absolutely everything I could to rehabilitate physically, you know, with putties and massage and connecting to my body and, you know, doing other exercises to keep myself fit. But certainly when I got back on the rock and it came time to lean back, which was when this accident happened, that association in my brain was still there. And it's that old expression, get back on the horse. I had to tell myself, this is fine. I'm not going to hurt myself. The knot's right. You know, the protection's all good. And then I just do it. And so you just have to step back in and allow yourself to feel that, because it's a brainwave, or it's a brain association that needs to be reassociated back to the way it used to be. And now it's fine. I don't really ever think about it very often. And I do check my knot though, especially at a climbing gym or something like that. You know, you can get distracted. And so I look every time I get lowered, and that's a good thing to do. And now
that's actually something I do while climbing many times. It's kind of a tick. You just check and check and check. One of the things we do.
Buddy check is a very good thing to do. So you check your friend. And that's something that I didn't learn as a new climber. We were just so, I don't know, naive about a lot of things. We were just opening our minds up in so many ways, but that kind of a practice was not instilled in us as a, you know, just like when you learn to drive a car, you know, look both ways. Those basic things somehow were not reinforced as they should have been.
Yeah. So I actually want to jump back in time to the late 70s and early 80s. I'm not going to talk about the drugs, but I do want to talk about the approach to climbing that was rather purist. If you can explain a bit about what that purist approach was and what was the meaning of purist when it came to climbing.
Well, if you think about the origins of climbing coming from mountaineering, it was practice for the mountains. And when you arrive at the base of a mountain, you can't just run to the top and throw a top rope down. You can't preview the route. You can't practice the moves. You have to go up on site, step by step, making every decision necessary. So that's kind of the way that the style of traditional climbing was developed. If you fell while you were climbing, you had to come back down to the ground and relinquish the rope, or I guess you could rest and try again. But usually if you're climbing with somebody else who's of a similar ability, you would give them the chance to lead. And oftentimes, if it was a scary route, you would go ahead and let them top rope up to the high point. That's called Yo-Yoing when you do that. It's not the most pure, but you know, if you're honest about how you did it and you try to do it in the best style possible, you know, then you're going to not hang dog, which is hanging on the rope and practice the moves. You're going to lower down, give your partner a chance, or try again yourself. But you were not allowed to practice the moves, which on one hand was a bit contrived, because in gymnastics, you had to practice the same trick numerous times, and then you put it into the routine and you perform. So, you know, an ascent is a performance in that sort of viewpoint. And if you fall on the crux moves, it's natural to want to learn how to do them so that the next time you get there, you know where that hidden hold is and you've touched it and you know what to do. So I think if we'd done that earlier, we would have progressed into the sport climbing realm earlier. But the advantage was that we became very good at on-site climbing and taking calculated risks. Because if you know you're going to take a big fall, or you know you really just want to do the climb without falling, you're going to look at the next hold, your brain's going to make all these calculations, and you'll wait until the right moment to go. Or you'll down climb, you learn how to rest, you learn other skills that you don't if you're just going to be practicing like a sport climb. So it had some advantages, I would say.
And from this reality of living with the guys outdoors, living the real rock warrior's life, you made quite a big transition. In 1996, you were invited to climb in France, and soon after you relocated to Europe and started competing, which is quite a different reality and scene. What made you go for this big change?
Well, it was an evolution. So as traditional climbing pushed into the higher grades, there was less protection. And it seemed to be logical that, you know, on blank overhanging faces, you're not going to be able to protect it with traditional gear. We were trying to leave no trace and do things the most pure way possible with the least dependence on artificial gear and that sort of thing. But if you go to Europe, or, I mean, obviously, you know what limestone is, you can't do the same climbs with those rules. So it became obvious that if you wanted to climb on these beautiful faces, you're going to have to adopt different ethics about bolting and how you bolt, because we weren't allowed to bolt from the top down either. You had to go from the ground up, and you had to hand drill in a lot of places. And it's very tiring to stand there. Your calves are burning and starting to shake because you're, you know, standing there for 20 minutes. And then, you know, if you fall while you're doing it, you're going to take a big fall with all this gear on you. Well, at least the drill that you've got. So this whole transition seemed like a logical one. And it had to do with the coming together of different people all over the world. We didn't have the internet quite yet at that time. So it was magazine articles, and it was people coming to Yosemite, or Americans going to the major areas in other parts of the world. And there were differences. The English were the most, I would say, traditional and hardcore about ethics. And they have this whole head pointing thing where I think you're allowed to top rope on this grit stone. And then in order to lead it, basically you have to sometimes make very dangerous runouts where if you fell, you would die. So they practiced it and then performed it. But, you know, the consequences if you fell were high. So the English had their influence on us, and I think we had our influence on the French. They used to call it French free, where, you know, in the Verdun, they'd climb up wherever they could, and then if there was a piece of gear, they'd just pull on it. And we'd be like, why would you do that? Why don't you just clip into it and keep climbing? Because we were more pure in our approach. But then you started looking at the really steep faces with those beautiful little finger pockets and no chance of really protecting it safely. The idea of being able to just clip bolts and not have all that extra weight and do these really interesting moves, that was appealing to me. And the way I got invited was simply through an invitation by the French Alpine Federation to the American Alpine Club. And they said, we're offering to take a couple climbers. You know, I think we could have been more than 4. We were 4 Americans and 1 guy from Taiwan, and that was it. 5 of us that were invited on this tour to go to Les Saussois outside of Paris. And then we went to Buttes, and then we went to the Verdun Gorge. And then on our way back, we went through Chamonix, but it was bad weather, so we didn't see a whole lot. And that was it.
But you ended up leaving there. You actually relocated to Europe, right?
That was much later. My first trip was just an eye-opener to understand what limestone was, what this whole sport climbing world was. And then ended up, sorry. Well, on that same trip, I ended up meeting the guy who's the head of the Olympic Committee today. He was the guy that organized the competition in Arco, the very first international sport climbing competition. So he saw me climbing on this hard route in the Verdun called Take It or Leave It. He said, you should come back. Later this summer, we're having a competition, and Catherine Destival, you know, you should compete with her. And so that's how I got invited back. It was in 1986.
Was that the competition where you didn't know the rules and they actually changed the rules throughout the competition?
Well, I did sort of know the rules. You know, they did change the rules, and I was at the very end of that competition on the very last super final route, or final, I guess. I did it on site, and Catherine fell twice, didn't even get up it. But since I'd fallen on one of the other climbs before that, and I didn't have time, they only gave you 9 minutes, I lost a lot of points. So we were tied, actually. But I had on-sighted the final, which was way harder than the other ones, supposedly. And we were going to do a super final on the men's route, and then they decided against that. So I missed the whole thing watching the men. I was out in isolation, and then they're like, oh, no, we decided that we're going to just determine who's the winner based on your style and your speed. Style was subjective, and it was just, you know, some experienced climbers watching us climb, and they said, yep, Lynn had better style, so I won that. But Catherine was a very fast climber. That's just her way of doing things. Very impulsive, very intuitive, and she's an alpinist, so speed is probably a good thing. But that was just, you know, the criteria that they decided was worth more, and it was arbitrary. I think that it had a lot to do with the fact that she was European. She was sponsored by a few of the companies that were sponsoring this competition, so it was better for them that she win than me. So I didn't think that was very fair, but I figured out that, you know, because it's so early in the development of competitions, people didn't have a very good idea of what to even measure and how to award points, and you know, how does time fit in. That, you know, it's still not a very clear picture, in my opinion. Obviously, the routes, the way they design them today, are much different than what they did back in the early days. And to me,
in what sense?
Well, first of all, my first point was that the person who designs the routes kind of designs who's going to win in terms of their style, right? So back in the day, it was mostly rope climbing on natural rock, and then it developed onto the artificial walls. But, you know, you could make it easier or harder depending on your size, right? And the people that were designing the routes were men, and they would just measure how far I could reach, but it's really not just about how far you can reach. It's about how long your legs are, and how, you know, sometimes you need a little tiny foothold to bring you up just a little bit so that you can actually make that distance, right? So there's that aspect that they didn't actually understand, was trying to make it equal for the size differences. But nowadays you have very flat surfaces, these volumes that stick out, and it's just a lot of compression and jumping and acrobatic. It's more like a parkour exercise where you're doing tricks. And yeah, you have to be strong, but it's a completely different type of strong than being on a rock face, you know, being on El Capitan, for example. A lot of the new climbers of today don't really know how to stand on those little slopey edges and or just little tiny dishes in the rock and just transition very delicately. That's a lost art almost, because it's not something you're going to find on an artificial wall. What you'll find on an artificial wall is these volumes where you're jumping and doing all kinds of crazy stuff.
Parkour style climbing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, despite being American and all this politics thing, you ended up winning 30 European and international titles, which is crazy. And still, I want to ask if you can elaborate on your experience from moving from Camp 4, the purest place, to sport climbing and indoor climbing.
Well, Camp 4 was a part of my passage, my rite of passage, let's say. I was from Southern California, which is quite a bit further south than Yosemite. And I was a high school student, and then I was a college student. So climbing was not my full-time activity. I went from almost getting a scholarship as a track, you know, running track and field, so that I could become a physical therapist or something in the medical related fields. So I didn't, you know, at one particular time before I moved from California to New York, I wasn't climbing that much at all. I was running more, but I was missing climbing. And there was this whole style war. People were, you know, sometimes getting into fist fights over this whole transition from traditional to sport. So I chose to move to New York, which was one step away. And that's where I got invited to go to Europe. And so New York was an important transition, just in my approach to say, I'm going to start all over again. And this is a new adventure. I'm going to learn about a different culture, different type of rock. And then I just continued that throughout the world when I moved to Europe. Then I, you know, having moved from California to New York was one stage. Then to move to Europe, that was just because I really loved learning. I ended up learning to speak French and then Italian based on just a little basic learning in school of Spanish, just the basic grammar. And I realized that I really like language, and I like feeling like a kid again and learning in that way. So it was for the climbing, and it was also for the whole lifestyle. So the competitions offered me a lot in that way. I could meet people from all over the world at these competitions. I could make some money out of it by prize money. And it kind of derailed me from going into physical therapy or some other profession like that, because I was having a great time. And that was, you know, worth following. You know, people always say, follow your passions, and that will get you, you know, I think a more, at least happier life. I don't know about financially. Some people just want to make money. So, you know, going into business was their thing. So after they stopped full-time climbing, they developed a product or something like that. So there's lots of different ways to go with your career as a climber, or just change your career.
And before we move on to your next very big chapter in your life, I want to read another quote of your autobiography about your competing part. I remember asking about the disparity between prize money for men and women. The only response I got was, if the women climb without their tops, then we'll pay them the same. How did that feel to hear that ridiculous statement?
Well, I grew up in California, right? Remember the quote from earlier. We were making progress, and I believed that that was the right way to go, and that was a done accomplishment. But I realized then that, you know, it's not the same everywhere in the world. And I think in Italy, their ideas about the roles are more traditional. And, you know, I remember if you're walking down the street as a woman, you'd get guys whistling at you. And it was just sort of like, wow, that's different. You know, you wouldn't do that necessarily. I mean, maybe a little bit. I remember vaguely being a kid in California and that being a thing, but it just seemed like it was slower to be considered sexist or inappropriate to say things or to act that way towards women. So it was shocking to me to hear that. And it was something I shared obviously in my book. And, you know, it was like a thing for me to have to realize that that's the way that guy maybe didn't believe that, or he was just joking. I don't know, but that is what he said.
Okay, you seem to give a lot of the guys the benefit of the doubt, and you're very calm in your response to that. We'll go back to that later. So I think it was in 1992, sorry, you've decided you want to quit competitions and go back to your first love, which was trad climbing. What made you go for that, back to the States, to rock climbing?
Well, I considered it like a retirement from professional climbing. And when you've spent so much time training and following, you know, your progress in climbing, it would be a shame not to do something with that ability at that time. So
I'm smiling because if you describe that as your retirement, you chose to do a very big thing after as your retirement present, maybe the nose.
Exactly.
So I wouldn't even. So after retiring, you went for the nose. What made you go for the nose?
Because I could, because I felt like I had all of the qualities necessary. The competitions over in Europe were not only a way to make a living or, you know, to be a full-time climber, but it gave me a mental edge. To be able to perform under pressure was a great thing. To learn how to read the rock, different types of rock, holds that you can't see. Limestone is a lot different than granite, but it opened my abilities as a climber. So I had that advantage. Plus I had all the experiences growing up in California as a trad climber, and you needed to be able to do that efficiently and be able to climb at a high level. So I combined all of the skills from, I think at that time, over 20 years of climbing, and the locals in the valley who I'd grown up with and knew, people like Backer and Ron Kauk, that wasn't their objective. They weren't focused like that. And actually, I was looking at footage a few days ago. I think it was in the early 80s. Ron Kauk, Beverly Johnson, and Warner Braun tried to free climb the nose, and they did a film of this, and it was really great to see. They did the Jardine Traverse, and they did some of the other little delicate sections, but they failed at the Great Roof. That was just, you know, not even underneath the roof. They failed even before getting to the roof.
Okay. It wasn't the Traverse. Actually, some of our viewers are quite young and don't necessarily know the difference, because people climb the nose. The nose is, we saw the picture before, it's a very, very well-known route in Yosemite. People have done it before. What is the difference? You did it in free climbing. Okay. Can you explain what that means?
Sure. So normally in Yosemite Valley, the big walls, we call it big wall climbing, because you're bringing up all your food and water for however many days that you calculate that you're going to be up there. And so there's a lot of different equipment. You have ascenders on the rope. We used to call them Jumars, but they're auto blocking devices, so that the leader will lead up and they will aid climb, which means if they get to a really hard section, they're just going to lean on their gear, clip into it. Maybe back in the day, you would even pound in a piton. And that's aid climbing. And there are routes where it's so thin that the cracks are you know, not even visible. Now there I'm Jumaring on Half Dome at the age of 17. So on that route, it wasn't as extreme. Most of it went free. I'm just cleaning the route or the lead that my partner had done. And so, you know, your job as the follower is to clean out the gear. Then it would be my turn to lead. But to free climb the whole route, that means that you have been able to climb up every single move on the entire route. And that's a whole different thing than when you get to the Great Roof, you just clip in and hang on and step on your atriers, their little ladders. That's a whole lot easier. There you can see I'm hanging on, I'm placing the gear. I'm not hanging on to anything while I place the gear. There was some fixed gear in the roof that you see, but it's very thin just to be able to hang on there. Obviously there aren't very many footholds. You're frictioning your feet flat against the face. The roof is kind of in where your head wants to be. So you got to duck your head and stuff your fingers into that little, they're probably like seams and sometimes pin scars. But that is one of the difficult sections. The other difficult section is the changing corners up higher. It's very, very smooth rock. There's not very much to stand on. So the only way you can do it is through opposite pressure. Pushing with your feet or your hands or lie backing off of tiny, tiny little pin scars. So it just required a big effort and a lot of power. And, you know, to do it in a day, that was the challenge because you've had to climb all this, you know, slab climbing to vertical. This is the changing corners now that we're seeing. That's past the difficulty. By the way, there will be a documentary film. You'll see more what the crux actually looks like. When this documentary comes out. I returned to the nose actually 2 different years, in 2018 and in 2019 in the fall. I went back with Nina Caprez, and the idea was that I was going to, you know, help her in the sense of being her support to make a free ascent. And she came about literally an inch away from doing it, and her foot slipped, and we were tired of being on the wall.
I'm kind of curious. Well, I do sport climbing, mostly single pitches. I like some of the projects I've been working on for a long time. I remember the moves, but that's like remembering moves of a 30 meters pitch. How well do you remember the moves of the nose?
Well, I have a lot of information in my head about it. All the key sections, I kind of remember what I did. I have a pretty good visual memory. There are details that I wouldn't remember specifically, like on the changing corners, it's hard even to remember where I put my foot exactly. And sometimes, you know, an inch or two of where you put your foot and when you let go to reach with a hand, that can make a huge difference. And it's very, a lot of small moves and very complicated that way. But the opening moves, I know exactly what I need to do. It's hard to see your foot around the corner though. You're in an iron cross with your arms and you kick your foot around into the other side of this corner with your hand on a kind of a ret. And then you have to create opposite pressure between your foot that you can't see on something that's hardly even a hold, really. It's just a bump on the face that's very, very shallow, not much at all. So it's a lot of just pressure, and then you match your hands on the arete and then put your fingertips in a tiny little pin scar and then use your foot to kind of push around. My left foot, because my right foot's on the face still, and my left foot kind of turns onto the arete, and then I can turn around the corner. And then I know exactly there's all these little hand things that I do, and I have
just so everyone knows, how long is this route?
It's 3,000 feet. 1,000 meters.
3,000 feet. Oh, it's just crazy. Think about remembering moves of 1,000 meters, and I want to state it again. Lynn not broke. It's not a woman first ascent. It's men and women first ascent. She was the first one to free climb it, and I'm interested in the response of the climbing community. What was the response to your record?
Well, I think it was big news. there was controversy at, I think it was Climbing Magazine. Yeah, it was Climbing Magazine. They had a picture of this guy, Casanova, this French guy that happens to live in LA. And he was climbing on a seawall, and that was their cover. And the picture of me was this big on the cover. It was a little inset. And by the way, Lynn freed the nose. But the cover was a guy on a seawall doing, I don't know, n'importe quoi, as they say in French. Nothing special. And then Rock and Ice did use me on the cover right at the end. John Backer and I and another friend went up, and we were taking pictures. Yes, that one. Yep, that was a John Backer photograph. So we just hiked up the back and wrapped down, took that picture. Because obviously, when we were on the actual ascent, we had, a simple camera, nothing too special. And we have a few souvenirs. The one with Brooke and I, when we finally did it, that was in '93. Then when I came back to do it again, it was really initially kind of motivated by a French filmmaker who passed away a few years ago, Jean Afanasieff. He said, let's do a film together. And I said, oh, okay, what do you want to do? And I'm like, well, how about, since we didn't get much footage or even photographs of the nose, let's go back and actually document this. But it wouldn't be very interesting to me or anyone else to just go back and make it a film project. What would be interesting is to add a new level of excitement, a new challenge. So I thought, wow, in sport climbing, we go from the bottom to the top without a fall. That's our red point. Why don't I try to red point this whole 3,000-foot wall, like adding a whole new level of challenge. Doing it in one day versus 4 days is a huge difference on a physiological level and on a psychological level, especially since the most difficult sections are at the top.
So you actually broke that record twice within a year. The first time you did it with a partner, a female partner.
No,
how long did it take you?
Not a female partner.
It was sorry, my bad. And how long did it take you?
Well, actually, if you count Mari, I was just aid climbing it back in 1979. I did it with Mari. You're right, but we weren't free climbing it. We we free climbed some of it, but it was French free. Back to whatever you do, it doesn't matter what kind of style, you just want to get to the top. That was the objective. And you want to
and the record, everyone's you did it in less than 24 hours.
So then there is a speed way of doing it. Like there was in 1976, John Long, Jim Bridwell, and Billy Westphey, they did the nose in 19 hours. That was like a big record because they did it in a day. But they weren't free climbing it. They were French freeing it. They were grabbing gear. They were doing whatever they had to do to get to the top. Then that became its own race. People, as you know, that it's been done in less than 2 hours by Tommy Caldwell and Alex Honnold. And that's a crazy fast time. It's running vertically, but obviously you have to make decisions about where you want to not put gear in and can you do it safely or safe enough. They did each take 100-foot falls while practicing for this. But they did have to, not use as much safety as they would have without racing the clock. But that's never been my interest. Doing it in a day, though, as a free climb, that was my objective. So climbing every step of the way, free climbing, and I led every pitch.
And after this amazing ascent, you had a catchphrase I really love and enjoy, and it goes, boys. And I know some regard it as provocative. Do you remember the comments about that?
Well, actually, it was a corroboration where that came up from. And it was when we went back up to get the pictures with John Backer. He was trying to come up with a line because at that time he had an interest in Boreal climbing shoes. And he went up to get pictures for an ad. And he wanted to have like some cute phrase, like, I think he started out with, someday some guy's going to free that route. And that would be like the line that you would, kind of typically hear someone say, some guy. And so to counter that, it goes, boys, was the kind of balance of that ad. So we came up with that together, and And then it became way more famous than I ever thought. You know, it goes, boys. I've seen a woman with a tattoo on her arm.
Oh, wow.
I've seen, you know, stickers, T-shirts, all kinds of things.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so hand in hand with all your ascents and winning competition came fame and publicity. Following your ascent of the nose, you participated in numerous TV shows, including Survival of the Fittest. Not very surprisingly, you've won 4 seasons in a row, beating, amongst others, some Olympic athletes. What was the experience of becoming worldwide famous?
Well, let me make one clarification. The Survival of the Fittest happened in 1980, I think, was the first one.
Oh, it was much earlier. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I was not known anywhere because, again, there was no internet, and climbing was so small. Who knew who? And you know, we read magazines and books about Europeans, but like our culture in America it had not been developed. So there was no fame for me for many years until after I, you know, started winning competitions. Okay, it started there. And then I think the nose definitely put me into a higher level of notoriety because I did it as a woman, and I did one of the most famous climbs in the world. You know, that's saying something pretty big. So I think for that one achievement, a lot of people know me because of that. And I think that, like I said, not having the industry developed at that point in the early 90s, it was growing. It was, you know, a much bigger thing than when I started, but it's a whole different thing now. You know, just to give you an example, like people like Alex Honnold, you know, he has his own federation. He's, you know, giving money to people for solar things, nice things, but obviously he's making quite a lot of money, and he's, you know, got a lot of pressure to do. All the professionals have a lot of pressure to have their Instagrams and their podcasts or whatever they're doing. When I was a professional climber, it was right off of competitions, and it was ads around the comps, and then, you know, of course, the nose. And then after that, instead of it being a retirement fully, I got sponsored by the North Face, and they had this new clothing line that they were trying to promote. So they put together like the Dream Team, I heard it was called, with alpinists, and we went on trips. So we continued the exposure and our jobs as marketing tools by doing really cool trips to really cool places. And then that basically stopped when I became a mother. Not that I stopped completely traveling. I've done some pretty cool travels with the Petzl Rock trip. They went to a lot of nice places, the most exotic being southern China. But I didn't have very much time. I went all the way to China for 5 days, which is kind of crazy. But, you know, I was really the one raising my son, the primary caretaker, and it's really hard to be a professional climber and to travel the world when you are the one that's taking care of your son and taking him to, you know, school and everything else that's required.
And since you mentioned it, being a mother, that's another very big chapter in your life. What is it being a mother and a professional climber, and a mother in general?
Well, I'm not a professional climber. That's the difference. I am a mother, and I make a living through my services, which is through climbing, but it's not through sponsorship. I do not take money from sponsors. Not that I wouldn't if there was something that made sense, but it's not what the sponsors want. It's not, I'm not saying that I don't have value to sponsors. I have a lot of ideas, design ideas and things that would be related to clothing and to some climbing structures. I don't have the time or the resources to develop them all, but if a company wanted to do that, I would certainly be open to it. But since that's something I can't control, I focus on what I can control. And I can control my Airbnb business, although right now it's a little bit challenging. And going around speaking is another way that I do that. I'm also a guide. I keep up my wilderness first responder every 2 years. So I'm certified rock instructor, they call it. And that's as far as I wanted to go. I didn't want to be a UFIMGA guide and, take people into that kind of terrain. That seems like very dangerous. And I think, the way I learned to climb was go out there and, you want to be with somebody who's got some experience and you're not putting yourself in danger, but you kind of do it by figuring it out, by being in that situation, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I just don't see that being a guide in places like Chamonix would be something that I would be psyched to do. It's just far too dangerous. So I'm trying to pick things that allow me to stay at home and be a mom. And so I have another project that I've been working on pretty much throughout my son's entire childhood. And it's a climbing technique video. And I define all the different techniques, when we use them, why we use them. I give tools like graphics that I put overlaid onto the video to show the forces involved, so that you can kind of deconstruct climbing and understand it on a conscious level. And I think it's something completely different that nobody's seen. Now that's taken a lot of time and money to hire an editor to do it, but that's something I can control. And it's intellectual property more than it is anything else. It's not a t-shirt.
I have to say I'm really fascinated and enjoy the fact that you've went through all these different stages and you're always motivated by something different. Okay, this is what I'm gonna do now. And in our preparation talk, we talked a lot about physical therapy and understanding the body. And so there are so many things that you're still doing. And even now that you're saying I'm not a professional climber anymore, you've gone for a pretty big project of, I don't know how many of you know this, but there is a Google Street View of Yosemite. Of which line is it exactly?
It's on the nose.
On the nose.
And there were pictures of the Dawn Wall with Tommy Caldwell. And there were pictures also of Alex Honnold. He's free soloing. This is at the base of the nose. But Alex, he does rope soloing. He doesn't free solo the entire route because obviously he hasn't free climbed the Great Roof yet. Oh, actually, no, he did. He has since. But he hasn't free climbed the changing corners. And it's not something that I would recommend to anyone to do free solo. But this picture you're looking at, that's at the edge of the Great Roof. This is the, up above me is the Pancake Flake. And that's where some of the pictures of Alex were. And you see that he's just hanging into jams there. And they're pretty nice jams, but he has no rope. And it's pretty freaky to see somebody way up off the ground like that, not tied in,
What made you go for this project? Because it's a lot of gear, a lot of cameras. It takes a lot of time. Why would you do that?
Oh, it was a really cool project. And I think it was really well organized. It wasn't as much work as I thought it might be, or cold. This was taken in like the third week of January. And I believe it was, that was a post shot. supposed to make you think of Warren Harding, drinking all that wine up on the ledge. So that was the Camp 6 ledge. You're looking up towards the changing corners. The first part of it is one of my favorite places to free climb, since it's just this diorite and it's really fun climbing. And then you get up into the corner and then it really starts to get serious there. But this is where we spent quite a bit of time recently on Camp 6. You're way up off the ground. It's such a beautiful place to be. There are a lot of people on the wall, but climbers are pretty good at sharing. Most people are pretty reasonable about whether they should let you pass, or, we lived respectfully on the wall, except for, things like trash and other things like that, urine that can be a little bit annoying, because in some spots on Camp 5, if you're on a ledge and you go to the bathroom at night, you're going to go right down on the climb. It's really hard to avoid. So I recommend people bring a pee bottle that they have next to them at all times. They clip it onto their haul bag in a way that it doesn't burst, but you can go when you need to go and dump it where you can so that it's not on the route, on people. You know, you actually climb on sticky rock in places. So you have to be respectful, and there isn't any regulation system right now. It's first come, first serve. So you go and you check out the parties that are on the wall, and you try to get there really early in the morning and beat anyone else who had the same plan. And, you know, whoever is fastest usually wins out.
So actually from the early days of being just a few rebels, now you have traffic jams on the rock.
Yeah.
So I'm actually, I have tons of questions I didn't ask and I want to ask, but I promise it's going to be an hour, and it's already more than that without the Q&A session. So I'm going to start concluding.
Okay.
I'm just having a lot of fun. If we examine your entire career, 40 years of climbing, not only did the sport go through enormous changes, but you've also changed. In many ways, it's a reciprocal relationship, from purist Camp 4 to free climbing to indoor competitions to back to tread. How do you feel about this evolvement of the sport and all these changes it has gone through?
Well, like I said, there's going to be pros and cons. It's going to be more crowded, right? That's one of the negatives. And when you have more people, you have to regulate access. You have to regulate the parking and the toilets, or the composting toilets, if that's the way it goes. And then there's cleanup. Then there's maintenance of the routes. As you know, having your club, there's bolting issues, and when do you rebolt? And, you know, so you have to rely on the community and have some sort of organization for that. And it's just harder and harder to get out. Like now, for climbers that right now in this situation, we're allowed to go out following certain protocol, but which areas are you going to go to where you're not going to find other people on the same routes? There aren't very many, because where I live, it's an urban climbing setup. You're not out in the wilderness so much. You could be, but it's going to take a lot more time to get there. And so that's, you know, you're just going to have more people, and you have to walk further, which is, you know, just a matter of time. I like walking, I like hiking, but it does take more time. And if you're a mom or a dad, and you've got a job and you've got to, you know, get it in 2 hours, there is no real easy way to do that in most of the urban climbing areas.
And where do you see climbing going to in the future? What is the next step? What is the next challenge?
Well, if you look at other sports that have been around for a long time, there's just more access to it. And you have seen with the climbing walls, there are many climbing walls all over the world. So there is more access, but you have to have money. And so that's a little bit unfortunate. There should be more support for people who don't have the money to spend to go to a gym. You could have outdoor climbing structures, but I think that the more climbing is available to people, the more competitive it will be, and the more all of the different areas will develop, because there's more attention and more excitement and more meaning for other people to be joining this community and getting some verification on who they are in some way. Because I think a lot of us are attracted to climbing for the community, for the, I'd say, progressive-minded attitude that we have, an appreciation for nature, even though the nature is getting more crowded. I think we do, most climbers that I know really appreciate those basic elements and respect those values. So I think it'll continue to get more attention, and climbers are going to get stronger and stronger. And you already see now at the Olympic level, it's the kids, just like in gymnastics. They're going to do their thing on this parkour kind of format. And maybe those people like Adam Ondra has good potential to go off from the climbing world of rock climbing and competition sport climbing. He could be one of those people that takes it into the big mountains. I've heard him say that he might do that. Culturally speaking, he's from Czech Republic, and I think there's a lot of respect for the true mountaineers. And so if you love that, and that's a new challenge, that could be a whole new area of development in the climbing world.
Now, before we move on to the Q&A session, just one last statement question. I've asked you throughout the interview about discrimination and gender issues, and you were like, yeah, it happened. I'm not taking it too seriously. And I have to say it's amazing. And I think it may be a big reason to as why you managed to break so many records and just don't mind things you shouldn't mind, and not listening to stuff you shouldn't be listening. And I'm kind of curious at how you perceive the evolution of women's rights in sports and in general. And do you feel there is equality in the climbing community nowadays?
It's hard to say because climbers are asked to sign contracts that don't allow us to share our financials. Mm-hmm. I know a little bit. I think that there is a discrepancy, just like there is across the board in all professions. A mm-hmm. woman who has children is at a huge disadvantage, much more so than a woman without. But even a woman without children will get paid less than a man with children for the same job. So there's a problem on a level that really impacts our psychology and our ability to change things. If you have less money, you have less power. And it's really hard to fight against those powers that are in the hands of men, I have to say. Most of the decisions with regard to politics and the big companies, here's a statistic for you, 2% of women are CEOs, only 2%. And that means 98% of companies have men that decide all of these things. Mm-hmm. So there's still a ways to go on that. I think that women are really good at adapting. I mean, people in general, our society is really good at adapting. So it'll be interesting to see how something like this pandemic will change the way that people look at work and mm-hmm. our ability to work at home, which can be very helpful for a lot of women. If this whole industry of at-home work seems to be working and producing the results that are required, then it might be a great thing for women. But yeah, it does bother me. I don't look at it as no small thing. I think that Mia Hamm and some of the soccer players have brought a lot of attention to the inequalities of the women's soccer team that has been doing way better than the men. But I
heard a podcast about that. They're more popular. They have more viewers, but they're earning less. It doesn't make any sense.
And they have to train on artificial grass. They don't get to fly in private chartered jets. They're not given the advantages that the men are, and yet they're, I guess you could say they're more valuable. And so why is that? That's just somebody's arbitrary decision. And that stuff bothers me. I don't think that that should be the case. I think people need to ask the questions and say, are we doing this the right way? Could we do this better? And until you're challenged and asked those questions, sometimes it's easy just to follow the stereotype and do what is familiar.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Lynn, at this point, I'm going to say again, I have so many more questions I would like to ask, but okay. I think it's time to move on to our next stage. Thank you so much for agreeing to participate in this interview and panel. The only question left is, when are you coming back? When are you coming to Israel?
Well, I think I heard you say in October you're doing your festival, right?
Mm-hmm. I have to go for it, yeah.
Well, I don't know this year. It could be the next year. My son is almost 18, so theoretically he will be an adult. There's no babysitting at this point anyway, but you kind of have to monitor your teenager and make sure that they're making good decisions, because this is when they make a lot of bad decisions. So I don't look at that lightly. But you have to also give some freedom. And in my childhood, it was completely different. I think the pendulum swing is completely on the other side now with this Generation Z, they call them. We've gone from millennials to Generation Z. And sometimes I like to joke that Generation Z stands for zero desire to work. They don't like to work. So, I try to be a good influence in the ways that I think my son needs to, wake up and realize that somebody's got to do the work. Something, you can't just all sit back and, play games and and not do the hard stuff.
Mm-hmm. So Ariel Gonen, one of our members, commented, and he's very right, that you're more than welcome to have him with you to Israel. And at this point, I would say you are invited, officially invited by the Israeli Climbing Association to Israel. We have a lot to show you and offer. And at this point, I would like to ask all our participants to open your videos, your cameras, if you want, and say hello, everyone. Hey. Super excited. That's the time to take a screen photo of everyone. Thank you, Lynn. It's been my delight to talk to you and with you. You're a heroine of mine.